Tonight's story is brought to you by FiendFX. FiendFX is a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to helping charities with fundraising by providing them with the most innovative scarehouse and walkthrough events. They have created fully adaptive environments for the sensory sensitive so that everyone can enjoy the experience. For more information on FiendFX and their services, please visit them on the web at www.phoenfx.org. Without further ado, tonight's tale awaits you, right through there.
Welcome, my friends. Come, sit around the fire and let me spin another tale for your amusement. These tales, I tell you, these nightmares found only around the fireside, speak of many things, things which cannot be explained. Stories of the unknown, the unseen, and poorly understood. Some disturbing, yes, some terrifying, certainly. Stories of the darkness which reside in all of humanity, expressed in ways in which nature herself cannot account for, things beyond her ability and even beyond her comprehension, stories buried in time and hidden by shadow. The perfect little town, quiet and peaceful, in the shadow of a tower castle on a hill overlooking the ocean in the beautiful country of Ireland. Will this tourist find a bit of respite before returning home? The American was late. Leaving the castle on time was difficult. Well, in truth, he had a terrible hangover. The staff at the Ballyonlacken had been very good to him and had even ensured that he had an appropriate wake-up call and a taxi waiting for him when it was time. But he was moving slowly, because of his head, because of his heart, because. He didn't want to leave this morning. He was abandoning his trip to Ireland a full week early. He wasn't ready to leave this place. No, there was still more to see, another town to stay in, more history to explore. But the email was persuasive, and the phone call after even more so. And all the things which preceded those two in Waterford and Roscommon on his exploration of the grounds of the castle, and 2 nights ago. But here he was at Shannon Airport trying to catch his flight home. His trip from the little town in Roscommon had been rushed, and the reservations for his stay at the Ballyonlacken Castle could not be modified. So he found a small and comfortable bed and breakfast in Doolin, less than 3 miles away from the castle. It was clean, basic, modern, and yet with a charm of its own, and as far as he could tell, the town of Doolin had no more than a common history of a quiet little town. Still, he didn't venture too far from his room, and when he did, he made sure he was in the room by nightfall, with every door and window locked. And to his great surprise and great joy, nothing untoward happened. It was a calm and peaceful few days in that small bed and breakfast, and he was almost sorry to leave. But Castle Ballyonlacken was supposed to be beautiful, and the accommodations did not disappoint him. The castle on the hill, now in ruins, stood above a country house turned luxury inn. The innkeepers on a fair day were more than happy to give any interested person or party a tour of the ruins, something which had great appeal to the American, a guided tour in the daylight as opposed to exploring it all by himself. And on that tour, the innkeepers shared a bit of history of the castle.
The original Ballyonlacken roughly translates to home of the Flatstones.
Though the tour guide would get an exaggerated, to the point of ridiculousness, conspiratorial look in their eye, start wringing their hands, and then say,
Sometimes lac is translated to mean tombstones.
and give an evil laugh for a ghostly moan.
It was built in the 10th century by the O'Connor clan, and in the 14th century it was that same clan that rebuilt it. In the 1560s, stewardship of the land, not yet called County Clare, passed to the O'Brien clan. The castle survived the purge by the Cromwellians at the end of the 1500s, all of the various battles and scuffles over the centuries, and both world wars. Today, it stands as a monument, a testament to times gone by, and to put to shame the architects of today, who, with all of their fancy degrees and tools, can barely make a building that lasts 100 years.
The country house at the foot of the hill has a shorter history, and yet it still retains the charm and, the American would admit upon gaining his room, the luxury of years gone by. His room was the epitome of this country luxury. He was lucky enough to have gained a suite with a large bay window overlooking the cliffs of Moher and the North Atlantic Ocean. And for a full day he stayed, mostly in his room, having light snacks and tea delivered to him by a pretty blonde-haired woman in her mid-30s who always smiled at him when she dropped it off. It was that break he needed, a break from the trip so far, a vacation from his vacation. And by the second day he grew a little more brave and decided to walk the grounds. It was a beautiful day, the crisp, clean air and a bright sun giving a little more warmth than what he had previously experienced in other parts of Ireland. The air itself was slightly salted and carried with it a very familiar and even comforting smell of the sea. It energized him, giving him just a little more impetus to go exploring, but not today, tomorrow maybe, and maybe the next day. The next morning, he took a leap of faith. The sea air had him feeling his oats, and so he decided that going horseback riding on the trails near the castle on the cliffs of Moher would be his next adventure. He spent 3 hours in the company of strangers, of tourists, of horses, and some of the most beautiful views he had ever witnessed. By the second hour, he had figured out how to ride and take pictures with his phone at the same time, and it brought him no end of joy to have done so. The next day, he found himself exploring, with a small group of tourists, the Doolin Caves. The caves were very different than the horse trails of the day before. It was 8 stories down, 125 steps, the guide had said, and walking in only artificial light. The atmosphere was different down there, and the American was feeling a little claustrophobic, but not enough to turn around. From narrow tunnels into larger chambers underground, the American felt his way around the wet limestone walls and water-speckled metal railings, and saw many wondrous things Mother Nature had created, and something he wasn't sure about. As they entered the large cavern where the massive stalactite hung down from the ceiling like a giant stone Art Deco chandelier, the American found himself falling slightly behind the tour group. He stood briefly, taking pictures of the awe-inspiring natural sculpture in its native habitat, where he heard a faint singing coming from the back of the cave. It was a woman's voice, an older woman's voice, much like his grandmother's, and she sang a soft yet sweet melody, one he almost recognized. Almost like a lullaby he knew he should have known or remembered, but for some reason he could not place. He looked around, but all he saw was the stalactite in the group, and no one in the tour group seemed to be hearing the song, and no one looked to be singing, even to themselves. He looked around again and caught just the most fleeting glimpse of a shadow in motion, and then the song stopped. The American hurried to catch up with the group, and though he made a point of taking more pictures, he also made a point of staying very close to the group. As the tour ended and all returned from the depths of the cave, the American was glad to see daylight again. The Eco Trail, a half-mile or so of nature walk which featured wildflowers, ruins, and so forth, was his next adventure. Though he very much enjoyed the short jaunt, the fairy village left him a little unsettled. In Ireland, he thought to himself, it's less fairy tale and more fairy fact. He returned to his room in the country house in the shadow of the castle on the hill, and he found he was right in time for tea. He had grown to enjoy tea time in Ireland. For him, it was a break from the day, regardless if that day had been easy or difficult, kind or cruel, and in that separation, gain a little perspective on it and on life. It was a time for active meditation and philosophical ponderings, and the snacks, be it cucumber sandwiches, fairy cakes, or another sweet, were both delicious and satisfying. He whittled the time away between tea and dinner, went down to the dining room on site, and had an excellent rack of lamb, and then rejoined the quiet and solitude in his suite, and enjoyed the night looking out the large bay window. Night had fallen, of course, but the moon was bright enough to give off enough ambient light to enjoy the surrounding lands if the suite behind him was dark, and the moon's reflection off of the ocean was peaceful to him. Sleep was not far behind, and he felt no need to move from the comfortable chair he was currently in. He awoke the next morning in bed. He wasn't sure how he got there, but he was there and comfortable. Equally as strange to him was that melody from the cave. It played through his mind over and over again, as if it were trying to jog his memory. The American got up and prepared for the day. Unlike the past 2 days, he had no set plans for today. Breakfast, though, was in order, and so he went down to the dining room and had an equally wonderful breakfast. From there, he decided a walk was in order, and so he exited the country house and spent most of the day wandering the grounds, with a jaunt into Doolin for lunch, and then back, hopefully, in time for tea. After Doolin, his explorations took him south of the castle on the hill, something he promised himself he would not be exploring alone, and he found a stream of beautiful, clear water. The sound of the stream brought him a deeper sense of peace in a way nothing ever in America had. There was a draw to it, something called to him through time, something that awakened something in his blood, a longing to be here, to stay here, a place where he thought he belonged. Something else then shook him from his nostalgic reverie. It was faint at first and unrecognizable, but then, as he focused his attention, it became clearer. It was a woman sobbing, and the sound of it broke his heart. The American walked upstream towards the sound and around a small bend when he saw an old woman kneeling at the bank of the stream. She appeared to be washing something in the water, and she was crying. The old woman's dress was worn and ragged. The shawl across her shoulders was threadbare, and several holes were visible from where the American stood watching her. Her feet were covered in an old-style Irish shoe called a gilly, which really was just a piece of leather folded up over the foot, pierced along the edges, and then laced with a leather thong. She wore only one visible stocking, and it too, like the old woman's shawl, had visible holes in it. She was the image of destitute peasantry, which was an odd sight in this modern era. To her side was a basket. Though the American could not see what was in it, he assumed it was more laundry. The old woman bent over the stream, washing an article of clothing in the water. It appeared to be a shirt, a red plaid flannel shirt, the kind his grandfather wore regularly on cold days back home. She wrung out the shirt over the river and placed it into her basket. She stood, and the folds of her dirty gray long cloak dropped, and the hem dragged upon the ground. The American stumbled in his thoughts and then regained the footing necessary in order to formulate the sentence he needed to. She wasn't wearing a cloak. The hood of the tattered garment came down over the old woman's face. She turned away from the American and walked back up the hill, away from the stream. Her footsteps were light, and no sound came from crushed leaves or snapping twigs. She moved fluidly on her way, much like a dancer, with no rise and fall of her head or shoulders, and nothing less than absolute surety in her footing. The American lost sight of her as she passed behind the trees. The old woman was still crying, and her sobbing laments and sorrow were heard even after she had disappeared from sight. The American's nerve broke. He turned and ran past the castle on the hill and towards the country house. When he arrived at the door, he was still visibly shaken. He gave himself a few minutes to try to calm before entering. After a few deep breaths, he heard a sweet and melodic Irish brogue behind him.
Are you all right, sir? You look as if you ran into Lucifer himself.
It was that pretty blonde woman which delivered his tea and the occasional meal to his room. She wore a blue tank top under a white long-sleeve cardigan, blue jeans, and tennis shoes. Around her neck was a small golden crucifix which glistened in the sun. On her shoulder was an old backpack, and in her arms was a brown paper bag from the shops in Doolin. All he could do was shake his head.
Come on then.
She said, opening the door for him.
Go on and sit in the dining room. Let me put this down and I'll bring you a strong cuppa. My gran always said that there is no better tonic for the nerves than a cup of tea, except whiskey and love, and she always been right.
He stood and looked at her.
Go on now,
she said with the stern authority of a mother speaking to her child.
Off with you to the dining room. Go find a seat by the window and I'll be right there.
He was halfway through his cup of tea before he could speak coherently on what he saw. She sat patiently with him, checking on him every couple of sips. He felt comfortable here, though, with his cup of tea and with her. When she asked, he started to talk about Waterford, and then stopped. He started on Roscommon, and then stopped.
Take your time, love, as long as your tea is warm.
He started again and told her about the cave, and then about last night, and then about his walk in the woods. She sat quietly and yet attentive to his stories. When he ended, she looked into her cup, and then to his.
Fancy another?
She asked, and then without waiting for him to answer, she took his cup from him and went back into the kitchen. She poured 2 fresh cups of tea, and as they sat steeping, she had words with the chef. He was in his 60s and had been raised in and around County Clare, with a large part of that time right there in Doolin proper. He had always been a chef, brought up in a kitchen, schooled in Dublin for it, and then back home to open a little restaurant and pub. Well, that didn't quite work out, and after a few years of bouncing around from pub to pub, they were hiring for this place, and he had been there ever since.
Ah, darling,
he said to her in a quiet tone.
I suppose it's possible, but typically only the old families see them. There haven't been many people here who've seen them, and of those that have, none of them from America.
Quietly, she protested. He assented to the possibility.
See here, missus, if she did come to him, then tonight may be a rough night for him. Take him his tea and I'll make him an early dinner. Make sure he gets into his room after. And then, be a dear and run down to Doolin. We'll be needing a bottle or 2 of whiskey.
The tea had been warm, and she was right. It calmed him. The meal, too, was a pleasant surprise and even more necessary tonic. It was good, but it laid heavy in his stomach and made him sleepy. The pretty blonde woman escorted him to his room, wished him a pleasant and peaceful evening, and then left him to his own devices. He sat again in the comfortable chair in front of the bay window. He sat for an hour and stared at the ocean. He then retrieved his phone, pulled up his various social media accounts, and began to scroll. There was a thump on the glass, and the American woke with a startle. This time, he was still in his chair. His phone fell from his lap, waking itself up and displaying the time after it had landed on the carpeted floor with a thud. The room was dark, and the window before him was dark, except there was a shimmer of grayish light, and then he heard a horrible scream. It was one of terror and suffering, and somehow it reached into the depths of his soul. Fear paralyzed him, and he stared wide-eyed at the window, and then she appeared outside. She was still dressed raggedly. The hood of her cloak had been thrown back to expose the lined and tear-stained face. Her eyes were red from crying, and her mouth hung open, showing less than a full set of jagged and well-worn teeth. Her bony hands were pressed against the window, and in her right hand was the red flannel shirt she was washing down at the river. Her feet hung, dangling 2 feet above the ground, and her whole being glowed like moonlight through a misty moor. Her face, her hands, and the shirt she held were all that were clear to him. The rest was diffused through a veil of fog. She spoke to him, and her voice was old, terrifying, and yet ethereal. She repeated her message 3 times.
Tasha Ita Awole.
She sighed, and her hands dropped. A gust blew, and the apparition was scattered to the wind. The room was dark again, except for the glow of his phone. He sat transfixed on the window, with labored breathing and sweat on his brow. It was as if he had just woken from a particularly hellish nightmare, and yet he had been awake for the entirety of it. It was a couple hours before sunrise, and he knew sleep was no longer possible. Finally, he stood from the chair, turned on every light in the room, and closed the curtains over the bay windows. He walked into the bathroom and ran a shower for himself. All he wanted right now was a warm cup of tea, but it was far too early to call down for one, so a shower would have to do. He shaved, brushed his teeth, and generally got himself ready for the day. He needed to, not because the day was close at hand. Indeed, there were still several hours to go. But he craved the sense of normalcy that a routine brought, and so he followed his normal one, and as soon as he was finished in the bathroom, he dressed himself and turned on his laptop to check his email. There was an email from his mother asking him to call her, whatever the hour may be. He grabbed his phone. There were several missed calls and a message on his Facebook from her as well, asking him to call her. All messages were sent within a 10-minute period. A 10-minute period which started just after the washing woman had left his window. He picked up the phone and called his mother. She was in tears.
Your grandfather had not been feeling well, and so we went to stay with him and your grandmother for a few days to help out around the house. We all had gone about our normal routine, and your grandfather sat down in front of the TV to watch the evening news. At bedtime, your grandmother had gone to his chair, believing he had fallen asleep in front of the TV, which he always did, you might recall. Your grandfather, he was unresponsive. The ambulance had just arrived when I first tried to call you sweetheart. That was almost an hour ago.
When the ambulance arrived at the hospital, the doctors in the ER room pronounced him dead on arrival.
I'm so sorry, honey, but the family needs you home.
His heart broke. He sat clumsily on the bed and stared. After several prompts from his mother on the phone, he agreed to come off his vacation early and would look for the first flight home. The phone call ended abruptly, which suited him. He needed to calm his whirling mind. He needed to figure this all out. That set in motion a flurry of phone calls, with the first one being to the airlines. The first flight out of Shannon, with room for him, back to the States, was for 2 a.m. the next morning. Almost a full day, but he had no choice, so he booked it. Canceling his other ticket and trying to get the credit applied to his new ticket was an hour on the phone in itself. And then there was waiting until a respectable hour in order to cancel the rest of his reservations for his trip. In that time, he packed his bags and prepared to leave Ballinacallan Castle. By the time he finished with his arrangements, the sun had come up. He headed down to the front to let him know that he would be checking out early and why. The kindly older woman at the front desk invited him to stay for breakfast, and then she shooed him into the dining room. As he left, she picked up the phone and rang the kitchen.
Your man is here at the front. No hung. He looks like death warmed over. Maybe she did find him. No. I sent him to you for a bite to eat before he left. Right. Thanks, love.
The pretty blonde woman met him in the dining hall and directed him to a larger table than his usual and sat him down. Within a couple of minutes, 2 cups of tea had been brought out to them by the chef. He told her everything. She reached out and took his hand, her eyes filled with concern. He felt almost ashamed with how red his eyes must be now. The chef returned with breakfast for him and 2 smaller plates of various edible bits and sat down at the table with them. He didn't ask what happened. No, he asked,
Who passed?
The American stared at him and then told him it was his grandfather. They sat quietly together, eating off their respective plates. As the American finished, the pretty blonde woman stood and gathered the plates. The chef looked at her and said,
Do you mind bringing out one of those bottles and few glasses for us on your way back, please? Oh, and tell my man back in the kitchen there that I'll be indisposed of for a little while. as will you be.
She nodded and left.
Son, forget what you think you know about Banshee, and you can be sure that's who that old washerwoman was who you saw.
The American started. He sat, unblinkingly staring at the chef as he continued.
It's not like in the movies or storybooks. You don't die after hearing them wail, unless they want you dead. But son, they only usually come to the old families. What is your family's name?
O'Sullivan, sir, was the answer.
A right proper family, true, almost as old as Ireland herself.
The pretty blonde woman came back with a bottle of good Irish whiskey and 3 glasses. The chef looked towards the blonde and said,
Mr. O'Sullivan here would like to have a drink in honor of his granda.
She smiled, opened the bottle, and poured 3 glasses. The chef turned his attention back to the American.
You ever been to a wake before, son? No, I would think not. So how it normally goes is that we drink and share stories. But you're the only one with stories, so we all will drink and you'll tell the stories.
He turned back to the pretty blonde.
Ah, missy, you forgot a glass.
She bounced back to the kitchen and returned hastily with a 4th. What's this one for? The American inquired.
It's bad luck to be having a drink at a wake and not be pouring one for the one you're waking. Now pull up a picture of old Grandad O'Sullivan on that phone of yours and tell us a story.
The American found the last picture of his grandfather he took, which was about a year before this trip. He was a stately man, not tall, but stout and handsome. It was a picture of him alone, standing in front of his house, smiling. He stood there with a full head of white hair, khaki pants, and a red plaid flannel shirt. The perfect little vacation, an escape to the old country in search of adventure. He certainly found it, didn't he? Will our American friend ever return to Ireland? Will he ever have a choice? Thank you, my friends, for joining us this evening for this episode of Fireside Nightmares.
Tonight's episode of Fireside Nightmares was sponsored in part by Fee and FX. Fee and FX, Cause and Effects. For more information, please visit www.feeandfx.org. The Washerwoman is an original story based off of a popular Irish legend written specifically for Fireside Nightmares. All rights reserved. Please stay tuned for the second half of our show as Josh and Story discuss tonight's episode and all of the interesting facts surrounding it.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome back to the second portion of Fireside Nightmares. I have Miss Story to my left-hand side here, and tonight we will be talking about The Washerwoman, the story that you've just heard. But before we get started, I need to make just a, quick and a very important announcement. Things are changing around here at Fireside Nightmares. And I think... I don't know if necessarily for the better or for the worse, but as our audience may know, we are haunters first and foremost.
And we about to get busy.
Knee-deep, into build season. So our format's going to change just a little bit. For now, we're going to do primarily the stories, and then as time permits, we will do a roundtable discussion with a whole bunch of people talking about the stories. Not that story, but not the story to the left of me, no. But the stories that are written and dramatized for us, various subjects around them, and whatever else happens to pop up. I guess it all depends on what story our barkeeper is pouring at the time.
Hey, you never know.
So tonight's story, The Washerwoman, is actually a variation of one of the many tales of a true Irish legend, the Banshee.
She's one of my favorites.
Right?
So.
What I didn't realize was how many different iterations there were of banshees, and even the rules that they are supposedly beholden to. I found it fascinating doing research in not just for the story, but of course for the podcast as well. She is, or they are, depending on who's telling the story, one of Ireland's, again, most famous native ghosts. Her cry, her scream, her wail is quite literally the stuff of legends. Yep. But what is she? This is where it gets interesting, and these are things that even I didn't know about banshees, because I think, I don't know about you, but my concept of banshees, of the banshee, was a very modern one. An old lady who screams and you keel over dead when you hear it. That's what I learned by playing Dungeons and Dragons. That's what I learned by watching popular cinema. That's what I learned by listening to the few stories that had come around about banshees. Now, my own family claimed to be Irish, but my last name is Grant, and that is not an Irish last name. So I don't know what my family was trying to lay claim to, but we are Scottish, not Irish. And we do also have our own version of the banshees,
and
which goes.
Don't mistake Irish for a Scotsman.
No. My family did it all the time. And I don't know why. I prefer the Scottish side over the Irish side. Now, I married an Irish woman, so let's not say that I'm actually playing favorites here. But as far as bloodline goes,
poor fella.
Oh yeah, you can try to console me.
She's a wonderful lass.
Yeah, well, and she's a blonde. It is my daughter who is the Irish Scots redhead. Yeah, that's the one I'm afraid of.
That's the Spitfire.
Oh.
As one ginger speaking of another, and I love my Tara. We are a force to be reckoned with.
Yeah, without a doubt. But getting back on target, because, well, I mean, my daughter isn't loud enough to be a banshee, and we're not going to talk about my wife in such terms. We'll go back to the more folkloric banshees. And interestingly enough, the term banshee, as one word, is just I don't want to use the phrase anglicized, but an English version of the phrase banshee. Well, what do you know? Finally, a Gaelic term that gets translated out, at least phonetically, accurately to English. And I'm very happy about that, which is probably why the legends of the banshee have traveled so far, where our friends, the host, which, because last time you said their name 9 times, I've had to board up all my windows and spray paint in luminescent spray paint your address, especially on the west side.
Exactly.
Thank you. No, but I forgot where I was going with that point. That happens frequently. My 50th birthday is coming up, so, and I've been hit in the head a lot. Those are the excuses that I use.
I'll go with that.
Yeah, I think so. Anyways, the phrase banshee is roughly translated to woman of the hills. Now, when you start looking at the various backstories of the banshee, that's where it gets kind of interesting. The first one, the one that I found really engaging, really interesting, were that the banshee were the remnants of the Tuatha De Danann, and those were the original gods and goddesses of Ireland, well before Christianity and even well before the Milesians came in. Now, the Milesians were considered the forerunners of Gaelic culture, so you're talking about gods and goddesses that existed in that land before the Gaelic showed up. Now, the Milesians, as I mentioned, are the forerunners of the Gaelic culture, and with them they brought their own belief system, their own gods and their own goddesses. And so as the story goes, it is the lack of worship of the native gods which caused them to shrink in status and in stature. And I think the Irish poet W.B. Yeats said it best when he said the bacon. Apparently, it's getting close to lunchtime because, the bacon has great appeal to it. No, the pagan gods of Ireland, the Tua de Danann, robbed of worship and of offerings, grew smaller and smaller in the popular imagination until they turned into
The Banshee.
fairies. Yes. Now, those fairies occupied Ireland, as we know, and they were also known as the Aos Shea. The Aos Shea means people of the hills.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as we mentioned in the last one, not all fairies are cute and cuddly like you'll find in Disney. Some of them actually make Tinkerbell look like an absolute angel. So you have the Banshee, which are women of the hills that were supposedly derived from the Aos Shea, which are the people of the hills, which were derived from the Tua de Danann, which were the old gods. That would make the Banshees one of the old gods.
Yeah.
That makes them even more scary when you think about it. But as we go through, we will see just kind of how scary they can be and to who they are the scariest to. But you look like you've got some paper in front of you as well, Miss Story.
I've got a lot of information on the Banshee.
Fantastic.
Starts off her signature shriek, her scream, her cry, her wail, her howl is stuff of legend. She is the Banshee, a supernatural songstress whose mournful melody precedes impending death. So basically, she's warning you of somebody who's fixing to die, whether it be a family member, loved one, or whatnot. Let's see. The Banshee roams the Irish countryside, hovering just above the ground like a vapor, gliding over bogs, passing Stinky Jack and the Dullahan and other Irish spirits in the night, perhaps. There is some unknowable magnetism pulling the Banshee toward the house in the distance, toward her target. She clatters against the shutters, peers through the windows, and she screams. Her scream twists and morphs into nasally, high-pitched dirge, punctuated by a burst of weeping. Hovering at the windows, the Banshee calls an old man to his death. She is a siren of spirit of doom singing exit music for life. Or at least that's one's interpretation of the folklore being known as the Banshee. Turns out there is much more to this character than is depicted in modern popular accounts. Indeed, there is a rich history of alleged Banshee encounters in Ireland and Scotland, as well as long-standing debates over what the Banshee looks like, hideous crone or youthful beauty, and which families direct descendants of the say the word Milesians?
Milesians, yeah.
Thank you. Can expect a visit.
Now, I will tell you that I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that particular phrase properly, the Milesians. The problem with being well-read but not holding conversations with scholars is that I actually don't know how to pronounce these words.
Okay, well, you do better not do so. There's that.
Yeah. It's what the voice in my head pronounces it as, and, well, of course, it's going to be pronounced by the alphabet I'm most familiar with.
Correct.
I do try to modify it a little bit, thinking that it probably sounds better as Milesians than Miles-ians. the people of Miles, well, then that would, of course, predate the metric system.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it goes further on into the definition of the Banshee. First things first, what is a Banshee? I mean, is it a ghost, a spirit, a wraith, a demon, fairy? In a word, it's all of those. There's some nuance to be found in defining Banshee naturally, so here's my best attempt at crafting a comprehensive definition. A Banshee is a supernatural being from Gaelic, aka Goidelic. I hope I didn't murder that.
Gaelic is fine. Yeah.
Okay.
No.
Kimberly, I'm sorry. Celtic folklore that takes the form of a shrieking or sometimes singing woman, often associated with particular families. Banshees warn of the impending death of someone in the household. In the Irish tradition, the Banshee is believed to be a remnant of the bringing of Tuath the Nun?
Tua de Danann.
Okay, we'll go with that. The gods of Ireland, who are defeated and driven underground by the invading Milesians, Ooh, I said it right.
Ooh, very nice.
Who represented the arrival of the Celtic culture. I can't say that. In Ireland.
At least you didn't say Celtic.
Oh, God. I had to correct somebody like that.
Unless they're talking about the basketball team.
That's the only time it's
Celtic,
used.
Yes.
Each member of the Tuatha De Danann, yeah, I said it, subsequently went on to occupy a mound or a hill known as the side.
Shay.
Okay. Thus, once gods became known as the Shay.
AOS, Shay.
Yeah, okay, there we go. Meaning people of the hills, and were relegated to fairy status. To quote Irish poet W.B. Yeats.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so there we go. It's funny how we always come up with the same material.
Well, it's when you talk about folklore and doing research on folklore, there's only so much information out there, and you're going to get a lot of cross information from people. Folklorists all come to about the same conclusion. They just use different words, which makes it interesting that they use different words, and I appreciate them using different words. But again, you start looking at the similarities between them all. Okay, well, yeah, a little poetic license here and there. But what I found interesting was the first-hand accounts of seeing a banshee, and there was actually one. What was her name? I have it written down here. Oh yes, Lady Anne Fanshawe, written in actually in 1820, was an account of the memoirs of Lady Fanshawe, who was alive between 1625 and 1676. And she wrote down, assumably in her diary, that she actually had an experience with her husband at the time of the banshee while staying at a friend's house, a Miss Lady Honor O'Brien. Now, this account is really interesting, and I found it fascinating. I'll just read it to you guys word for word. Let's see. There we stayed 3 nights, first of which I was surprised by being laid in a chamber when, about 1 o'clock, I heard a voice that wakened me. I drew the curtain, and in the casement of the window I saw, by the light of the moon, a woman leaning into the window, and through the casement, in white, with red hair and pale and ghastly complexion. She spoke loud, and in a tone I had never heard, thrice, a horse. And then, with a sigh more like the wind than breath, she vanished, and to me her body looked more like thick cloud than of substance. She goes on to say, I was so much frightened that my hair stood on end and my nightclothes fell off.
I'm sorry.
At best, that reminds me of a cartoon.
I have never been so scared that my clothes have fallen off. I've been so drunk that they have appeared to fallen off, but there's that.
I'm so afraid that my nightgown just fell directly onto the floor, and I stood there completely exposed to that thing for which I was... That is an 80s horror movie. That
Totally.
And we're going to stick with the 80s horror movie because that could go somewhere else very, very quickly, and we're not going there. Anywho, I pulled and pinched your father, meaning her husband at the time. This apparently was sent to the son in a letter, or a child in a letter, who never woke during the disorder I was in, but at last was much surprised to see me in this fright. I would be too. And more so when I related the story and showed him the window opened. Neither of us slept any more that night. But he entertained me with telling me how much more these apparitions were usual in this country than in England. And we concluded that the cause of the great superstition of the Irish and the want of that knowing faith, which should defend them from the power of the devil, which he exercised among them very much. About 5 o'clock, the lady of the house came to see us. She said that she had not been in bed all night because of a cousin O'Brien of hers, whose ancestors had owned that house, had desired her to stay with him in his chamber, and that he died at 2 o'clock. And she said, I I wish you to have had no disturbance, for 'tis the custom of the place that, when any of the families are dying, the shape of a woman appears in the window every night till they be dead. This woman was many ages ago got with child by the owner of this place, who murdered her in his garden, and flung her into the river under the window. But truly, I thought not of it when I lodged you here, it being the best room in the house. We made little reply to her speech, but disposed ourselves to be gone suddenly. I would be too. It was a very smart move on their part,
Definitely.
saying, I thank you for having us over, and I really appreciate your hospitality, but I don't do peeping toms. And especially old women screaming, a horse, 3 times at me. I have yet to figure
make my clothes fall off.
me being so scared that my clothes fall off after, this old woman stands at the window screaming a horse 3 times. What I don't understand about that particular story that was related, was where the horse came into all of this. Why would the banshee sit there and scream a horse? And why would she do it in English and not in Gaelic?
True.
But, maybe she was just a hysterical woman. Maybe she just liked wandering the house with her clothes off. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe she really did see a banshee. But that is, when you start looking at the behavior of the banshees and a lot of the folklore that surround it, unusual behavior for a banshee. Not a big fan of forgive the phrase, but of non-pure blood Irish.
Right. Let's see. Another author, he published a book in 1888. D.R. McNally, Jr. Published a book called Irish Wonders. It's impossible to deny the characteristics of the banshee as a ghost or a spirit, an ethereal, wispy, semi-transparent female phantom. The banshee is really a disembodied soul of one who is in life was strongly attached to the family, who had good reason to hate all of its members. The banshee is one spirit who looked with interested eyes on earthly doings and deep attached to the old families, or on the contrary, regarding all of their members with a hatred beyond that known to mortals, lingers about their dwellings to soften or to aggravate the sorrow of the approaching death. So essentially, she was like death coming to escort them, but she was basically warning the family members of the said coming death.
I'm about to get my revenge, FYI.
And just start screaming top of her lungs.
Yeah, right. I mean, who has not faced an enemy and not wanted to scream at the top of their lungs? Especially when revenge is on your mind and it's going to happen. What are they going to do? Stop you from screaming? Ooh.
And actually, McAnally's definition strips the mythology away from the folklore. He goes on to say, a recurring theme as Ireland and Scotland underwent Christianization. Under the folklore interpretation, banshees are not ancient Irish pagan gods living on as fairies, but are actually ghosts of dead family members.
Which could very well be as well. It's I mean, who knows what the recruitment process is for the banshees, because there's not just one, there are multiple there.
Yeah.
So maybe they followed their friends, the hosts, and I'm not saying the name again, thank you very much. And they do have a certain recruiting process that they go through. Now, an interesting factoid about our friend D.R. McNally there. His grandson grew up listening to all of the stories about Irish folklore and Celtic folklore throughout the area. And I think it scared him to no end, so much so that he took up cartography in order to be able to map out more effectively the places that he wanted to avoid.
Right.
That grandson, Rand McNally.
That's awesome.
Thank you. I'll be here all week. Trying to feel.
Basically, as it goes on, I propose a third explanation for the banshee origin, one that combines the divine with the spectral. What if the banshee was originally imagined as a ghost of a goddess of the Tuatha De Danann? Ah, got it.
2A. Close.
A powerful goddess associated with life and death and cemeteries, and regarded as the inventor of the high-pitched singing style. Keening is what it's called.
Yes, I think I know where you're going with this one.
That has been used to such great effect in the banshee lore. It goes on to say, yes, I have someone specific in mind. Have you guessed her yet? Starts with a B.
Yep, I've guessed her.
And
Bridget.
there you go.
Bridget, who lost her son in one of the great battles. I think his name is, well, I'm not going to try to pronounce it other than possibly Rowan. And as he lay dying or dead in the battle, she found him and cried, sang a song so sorrowful about his life and how much she'll miss him. It started the traditions of what they called keening.
Yep.
And keening is that wailing that you hear, of course, a more organized version of wailing that you'll hear at Irish funerals before they start the drinking.
Yep. It says, I'm going to save the big reveal for later. Skip ahead if you must. I understand. In the meantime, there's more pressing matter to which we need to attend, one that will help us to better understand the nature of the banshee. Why do we call the banshee a banshee? How did she get her name? The English word banshee is derived from Irish being she.
She. 2 words.
Okay, which according to historian Peter Beresford Ellis, translate literally to "woman of the hills." So, and you've already touched on that, so we're not gonna redo what you've already done. Okay, so let's go to the next topic.
Right.
Okay.
So what I found interesting, and we'll kind of sort of jump around here a bit, but what I found interesting was that our popular conception of the banshee, she looks like an old, ragged woman who's, as we heard from the good, what's her name? I've already forgotten her name. Oh, there it is. That's why I write this stuff down. Where did she go? Oh, well, Anyways, the account that I just, Farenshaw, I think, that I just read was that she, of course, described it as being pale and ghastly complexion with bright red hair. Funny thing about that is that, although in popular conception we think of it as more, we think of the banshee as more of an old woman, kind of decrepit, but that's not how she's always presented. In fact, there are some traditions out there which have her appearing as a beautiful young woman.
Yep.
Flaxen black hair, perfect complexion, almost vampiric, without the need to, suck blood.
Right.
Yeah, But that's just not, and it's not just black hair, apparently. As my notes tell me, burnished copper, which is a great way to say red, and brilliant gold.
Ooh, blonde.
Bright blonde, bright carrot top red, or black hair. Very youthful, if you think, very healthy looking hair to have that bright colors. Now, when you start talking about the old Irish gods, the Ture, you would expect that you would find that black hair or that bright burnished copper hair. Although the red hair is often thought of more of a Gaelic trait, so that may have been brought in later. The blonde hair, one would think, would have come from the Normans, the Vikings. So we may just be dealing with either black hair. Now, I notice they didn't talk about brown hair either. This seems to be a ridiculous point to be focused on. But I find it a little fascinating about the hereditary traits of the banshee and how they look and how they present themselves, especially as incorporeal spirits or semi-corporeal spirits. You never hear about banshees smacking people around. You never hear about them running people
she just
around.
screams at you.
She just screams at you. You never really come into a physical contact with them. Which, is probably a good thing. That puts you in a whole different class of spirit now, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. You can be anywhere from the evilest of vampires to, Patrick Swayze in Ghost.
Yeah.
I wouldn't consider him a banshee, though.
No.
No. His hair's not pretty enough.
No, it wasn't.
No.
Not even back then.
No. It was better in Roadhouse.
That's those. Oh God, Roadhouse.
And here we go. Now, one Miss Lady Jane Francesca Wilde wrote in a book back in 1919 that the banshee can assume the form of a sweet singing virgin of the family who died young, and has been given a mission by the invisible powers to become the harbinger of coming doom to her mortal kindred. At night, she might even be seen as a shrouded woman crouched beneath the trees, lamenting with a veiled face, or flying past in the moonlight and crying bitterly. I think that would be kind of scary for a village of people. I would prefer to think that banshees come and visit you personally to let you know that somebody in your family is dying, instead of something coming screeching across the sky and everybody in their house is going, "Oh my God, who's next?" We're about to lose a fifth of the population of this village because of one screaming, hysterical woman flung across the sky. Mm-hmm. Where do they hide that catapult anyways? What a cruel joke to be playing on something.
That'd be fun.
If you think, now, if you were a woman, you were launched out of a catapult, don't you think you would scream?
Yeah.
I know me being a guy launched out of a catapult at night would probably scream going through the sky too, mostly because I'd be afraid of the landing.
The sudden stop.
The sudden stop at the end. Let's see. So we got the beautiful woman aspect. We got the haggy aspect of it that we've talked about, right? Haggish, wild, disheveled-looking critters. Utmost squalor and foulness and despair. Well, that is a terrible sight to see. Let's see. What have we got? We got wholly diabolical, whatever that means. I understand what the definition of the words are, but when you're talking about an actual physical appearance, diabolical doesn't have any benchmarks that you can say, "Oh, he looks diabolical. Oh, she looks diabolical." But I would assume they mean scary or evil looking, frightful, and terrifying in the extreme. God, I'd love to have a picture of that, though, wouldn't you? But this is the one that I found really fascinating, and it's what the stories was based off. There are some traditions, and you'll find them more in Scotland than you will in Ireland, and even down into the reaches of Portugal, where the banshee is depicted as a woman washing clothes and crying while she does it. And I thought that was kind of interesting.
Well, in the Portugal culture, they are known to wash the clothes of the dead before they bury them.
Well, that would make more sense then.
Yeah.
That would make more sense then. That part I didn't know about. Of course, I didn't follow through like I should have. But that's why we have you. Isn't that right in the story? And it's awfully nice of them to wash the clothes before you bury them in it. Everybody wants to have that downy, fresh shirt and a clean pair of chonies when you're getting lowered into the ground.
They gain freshen uppers.
The scent beads. Yes. Oh, you smell wonderful, and you will for the next week. And then I can't help you after that.
Once decomposing starts.
Of course, if you think about it, it might, ward off the vultures. Vultures can smell things up to under, which is why we're buried 6 feet underground, because those vultures can smell up to 4 feet underground.
It's the vultures and the dogs and the coyotes and all the fun stuff that likes to nibble at your greasy parts when you're dead.
Yeah, and they will go dig you up if they can smell you. So 6 feet underground is usually considered to be enough to stop them from doing that. But I think, dryer sheets and the scent beads would work out really well. You get a nice flowery, although cheap, laundry detergent from, and you'd be reeking up a storm, but you won't smell like corpse.
Yeah. There's that. So,
let's see, what else we got here? Oh, well, we can't talk about a banshee until we talk about the noise they make. The thing of legend itself, because it doesn't matter who delivers it. Well, I guess it really does matter who delivers it. But what does a banshee sound like? Now, of course, popular conception is a wildly crazy, despair-filled, high-pitched, nails on a chalkboard kind of scream. That would be the last thing I would want to hear when I was dying, by the way. Yeah, I mean, it's no thank you. But I think the folklorists have come to just sort of a general unwritten consensus that it depends on the goal of the banshee. If they want you dead and they want you terrified when you do it, yeah, that's a great scream to use. But what if the banshee feels kindly towards you
and loves you?
Yeah. What if they love you?
Or here's another aspect. If you were a good person, you get the nice one.
It's true.
If you're a bad person, you get the choir of demons.
Yeah, well.
So.
And which is kind of funny when you think about the phrase "the choir of demons," because that always brings up to me the Charlie Kirk band and The Devil Goes Down to Georgia, and his band of demons fighting over a soul versus the golden fiddle.
Yeah.
And Johnny, he did good on that one.
Yes, he did.
But that's neither here nor there. He wasn't going after a demon now, or a banshee now, was he? Because the devil himself, he wasn't singing. Although I imagine if the devil was singing, it would sound a lot, well, I guess it depends on his goal too, wouldn't it be? But I would think that it would sound a lot more like a banshee scream of tradition than a soft lullaby.
Right.
Now, if the banshee loves you, getting back to our friends the banshee loves you, it is reputed that they will actually sing something close to a lullaby, a soft melodic tone, something to kind of ease you into the idea that either you or someone you love is about to cack off. If they hate you, of course, we know what it sounds like when they hate you, but what if they're indifferent towards you? What if they're indifferent? They just come up and they say, "Ah!" "Oh, yeah, kind of like an alarm clock. I guess someone's dying." "Who would that be?" "I don't know. You want to take bets?" "Sure. What are your odds on Uncle Joe?" "I'll give you 5-1 on Uncle Joe. He hadn't been looking that well." "All right, I'll take that bet." It's probably not what the banshees were used for. If so, they would have to, set the odds themselves, and you could probably tell by the scream. Yeah. No. Okay. So then we get into who gets visited by the banshees. Obviously, it's someone who, you've got a family that's going to have a member that passes. But everybody has had somebody who died. Not everybody gets somebody who screams at them. Well, you get a supernatural being, an entity that screams at them. You get a lot of screaming during death, and especially reading of the will.
Or thereafter.
Yeah, exactly. It is said that only the oldest families, those the directly descended from the Milanese or the Milesians, almost said Milanese. No, we're not talking about the Italians. No. The Milesians. And those are the old families, the ones that are prefaced by Mac or by O, like the O'Briens or the O'Sullivans or the, oh my God, here they come again.
The McIntyres.
The McIntyres. Those who were directly descended by those people who brought their own gods and supplanted the Tuanades. Or, sorry, Tuatha Danans. And if you think about it, that would make a lot of sense.
Yeah.
That would make a tremendous amount of sense. Interestingly enough, though, my aunt was married to a Sullivan, which was an O'Sullivan at not so long in their family history. And as far as I know, she was not visited by a banshee upon his death. On the other hand, he may have been visited by a banshee and wouldn't know it because the man was, although a very nice man, he was a roaring alcoholic.
As most Irish and Scots are.
Well, I won't go that far, thank you.
I said most.
But there is a certain appreciation of the drink, and you get into those terrible phrases like Irish courage, which, yeah, those of you who have had enough to drink understand exactly what Irish courage, quote unquote, is. I know I've had it many a time myself and live to regret it.
But did you die? And did you have fun?
Yes.
As long as jail time was not involved, you're good.
Yeah, well, I have been lucky enough to avoid jail time, mostly because I'm smart when I get that stupid. No, I'm smart before I get that stupid. And I make sure that if I'm going to be that stupid, I'm stupid in a capacity that I won't be carted away.
I have built money on retainer.
Yeah, well, that the story, that doesn't surprise me.
But that's smart.
Well, yes, absolutely. It's preparing for the future. It's like having a 401k.
Exactly.
What else do we have there in your pile?
It goes into going into the keening and why are banshees so good at it.
A lot of practice.
Derived from the Irish word. Oh God, I'm not.
Don't. Yeah,
no.
It's so.
It basically means to cry or weep. Keening was a mournful practice that persisted into early modern Ireland. It's similar to a chant, only to be performed with a strained nasally voice. Keeners punctuate their melodies with bursts of weeping as well as moments of silence. The results are both incredibly sorrowful, deniably eerie, perfect banshee music to be sure. I know that with my background, most pagans, when we have a passing of a loved one, we do a chant of keening, basically kind of the same tradition,
right.
before we proceed to enter them in whatever manner, whether it be cremation or Viking funeral, So,
Which is kind of like cremation, just out at sea.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And bows and arrows.
Turning you into fish food.
Yeah, well, with your horse and your woman and a lot of your worldly possessions. As long as you have your sword, though, with you, you're good.
Correct. Now, according to the legend, keening was invented by Irish goddess of poetry and of fertility, Bridget.
Bam! That's right. I got the B word.
Yes, she did. Not to be confused with Saint Bridget of the 5th and 6th centuries. Bridget of the Irish mythology is a tribune goddess with cognates in both Brittonic mythology as Britannia and Gaulish Celtic mythology as Brigidado. I think I'm saying that right.
Whatever.
As the daughter of Dagda, the father of the gods, Bridget holds the exalted position among the Tuatha De Danann. Her cult was significant, and her ancient Irish worshippers held one of their four cross-quarter day feast, the major holidays in her honor, Imbolc, February 2nd.
Ooh.
Day of the Lights. Here's how folklorist and Professor Julian Osborne McKnight describes as Bridget Imbolc the connection. It says, because lambs are origin of the holiday, it was dedicated to Bridget Anu Dana, a three-faceted goddess, the protector of everything creative. The primary figure of the Trinity was Bridget. She protected ewes, hearth fires, poetry, blacksmiths, pregnant women, midwives. In ancient times, it was believed that she would visit and bless the hearths of the people, leaving her footprints in the ashes. Because Imbolc signified spring and return to light, the festival utilized candles and hearth fires by symbol of hope.
Aww.
So it's actually a pretty cool festival.
Oh, I believe it. I believe it. Much like Diwali. Much like Diwali in the Hindu traditions. And, practically any other festival of lights that you're going to find out there. You know, you can even go into Christmas, and with all of the lights there, it is less of a tradition, more about actually bringing light to the darkest times.
Correct.
Interesting, though, that they would do it in February when they were coming out of the darkest times, as opposed to...
It's more signified towards the coming of spring.
Right.
And the fertility of the land.
Yeah, which is really cool stuff.
I need to get closer. Sorry.
No, that's quite all right.
Another thing is that another topic was, who do the banshees visit? Learning about the haunting habits of the banshee has got your spine tingling and your knees knocking. Good news. Statistically, you're immune. Or rather, if such a being as a banshee truly exists, it's unlikely she'll ever pay you a visit. Unless, of course, you're Irish. But not just Irish. And I promise I'm using the word just in a gentlest of ways.
The pure blood argument is coming into play.
Irish folklore dictates that banshees will only attach themselves to members and or descendants of Ireland, or the old families, as D.R. McNally Jr. calls them, or families of the pure Milesian stock, and never ascribe to any descendant of the proudest Norman or boldest Saxon, to quote Scottish poet and novelist Sir Walter Scott. So yeah, there's this whole blood purity and ancestry component to the banshee lore, and Sir Walter Scott alluded the lore is rooted in Irish mythology only.
And deep Irish mythology, well beyond the the coming of the invaders.
The Milesians were the last race of the invaders to settle in Ireland, conquering the Tuatha de Danann and sending them underground. Yes, you heard that right. The Milesians and the forerunners to Ireland's modern human population were responsible for literally and figuratively burying the goddess Bridget and her divine kin. I mean, if I were Bridget, I'd hold a grudge too.
I would be a little upset about, somebody walking in and telling me that I'm not as good as somebody else. You walked into my house and you told me that I was not as good as someone else. Mm-hmm. What do you... No. There's the door.
Elliot O'Donnell goes on to say, I do not believe that the banshee would be deterred from haunting a family of historical fame and Malaysian descent, such as the O'Neills or the O'Donnells, simply because in that family was an occasional strain of Saxon or Norman blood. Well, a lot of raiding and looting and stuff.
Intermarriage. I mean, there's you can only keep your blood pure for so long, or else you start getting some really nasty genetic kickbacks.
Correct. On the other hand, he did not think the banshee would ever haunt a family that was not originally, or at least Celtic Irish. For instance, the Fitz family, or the Fitzwilliams, or the Fitzwarrens. Although in that family, there might happen to be a periodic infusions of the Malaysian blood.
Well, if the genetics fits. Alrighty, my friends, we have had a wonderful time here talking about the banshee and all the things that go around the banshee, the looks, the sounds, the feels. They even
have her in video games.
That they do, and she, being one of the most famous of all of the Irish ghosties, has also been one of the more well-traveled ones, going from country to country and
there's even a tale in New York about a woman in white, and she's on the cliffside wailing for her daughter, who was thrown over the cliff by a murderer, and she goes there every death anniversary, and sits there and wails for her daughter that was thrown over the cliff.
See, very, very banshee-like behavior in one aspect.
And she also had red hair.
And in other aspects, though, it's not, well, I would assume then the bloodline in that particular story is over with, so she's not has anybody to warn about it.
Right.
But I can imagine that if that particular ghostie figured out who it was who threw her daughter over the cliff, That would be one bloodline I know I would want to haunt.
Right.
Yeah, just to remind you of how stupid your great-grandfather was.
Yep.
Yeah, you don't make those same mistakes.
Definitely.
All right, my friends, and again, thank you for joining us this evening for all of our talks on the Banshee and, of course, our story, The Washerwoman. Before we sign off, again, one more time, the big announcement that we will be changing our format. Just a little bit, going to more of a story format because we are in build season now. We shall see what happens, though, after haunt season is over with. So on that note, good night, Miss Story. Thank you for joining me, and we will talk to you all later.
Good night.
The second part of tonight's presentation of Fireside Nightmares was sponsored by Everbright Solutions. When you need your lighting display done by professionals and done right, Everbright Solutions is there for you. Find them on Instagram at everbright_solutions_LLC and also by Retikes. Retikes is a leading manufacturer of service calling systems, guest pager systems, tour guide systems, window intercom systems, conference devices, FM transmitters, and radios. Find them online at www.retekess.com. Be sure and listen in next time for the newest installment of Fireside Nightmares. And just as a reminder, our format is changing. It will be the same great stories with less chatter starting next week.